When you are new to security architecture, one of the hardest feelings to manage is the sense that everything could be a problem at the same time, especially once you start learning how many different vulnerabilities and attacks exist. If you treat every weakness as equally urgent, you quickly end up overwhelmed, and the architecture becomes a patchwork of rushed decisions that do not fit together. Good architects learn to prioritize, not because they do not care about security, but because time, money, and complexity are always limited, even in well-funded organizations. This episode focuses on two tools that help you prioritize risk decisions in a more structured way: CVSS and threat intelligence. The goal is not to turn you into a scoring machine or a news reader, but to teach you how to combine structured vulnerability severity with real-world context so that architecture choices reduce the most meaningful risks first. By the end, you should be able to explain why one architectural change deserves immediate attention while another can be scheduled later without being reckless. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, is a standardized way to describe the severity of a vulnerability so different people can talk about it consistently. The name is long, but the idea is straightforward. If a weakness exists, how bad could it be, and how easy would it be to exploit? A vulnerability might allow remote attackers to run code, or it might require local access and complex steps, and those differences matter. CVSS tries to capture that in a structured score, usually presented as a number along with details about why the number is what it is. For architecture work, the most important part is not memorizing the formula, but understanding what the score is trying to reflect. It helps you separate issues that are likely to be exploited and cause major impact from issues that are niche, hard to trigger, or limited in scope. Think of it as a severity language that helps you compare problems that otherwise feel incomparable. CVSS is built around the concept of metrics, which are like ingredients that describe different aspects of a vulnerability. Some of those metrics describe how an attack would work, such as whether it can be done over a network or requires physical access. Others describe how complex the attack is, whether special conditions must exist, and whether the attacker needs credentials. There are also metrics describing impact, like whether confidentiality, integrity, or availability is harmed, and how much. For beginners, it helps to visualize this as two buckets: exploitability and impact. Exploitability is about how feasible the attack is in practice, while impact is about what the attacker gains or what breaks if the attack succeeds. A vulnerability with high impact but low exploitability might be serious but less urgent, while one with moderate impact and very easy exploitation might become urgent because it is likely to be used. Architecture decisions often focus on changes that reduce exploitability across many components or reduce impact through isolation and least privilege. A common mistake is treating the CVSS number as a direct instruction about what to fix first without asking what the number assumes. CVSS is often calculated based on a general idea of the vulnerable product, but your environment may be different in ways that change real risk. For example, a vulnerability might be rated severe because it can be exploited over a network, but if your architecture places the affected component behind strong network segmentation, and it is not reachable from untrusted zones, the practical exposure changes. Another vulnerability might have a moderate score, but your design uses that component in a way that makes the vulnerable feature always enabled and reachable, which increases real risk. This is where architecture thinking matters. You are not just patching. You are shaping exposure and impact through design. CVSS gives you a starting point, but you have to apply context to decide how urgent a change should be. Context is the bridge between a generic score and a specific system. Threat intelligence is one of the main ways you add that context, but the phrase itself can sound mysterious if you imagine it as secret information from spy movies. In reality, threat intelligence is simply information about threat actors, techniques, vulnerabilities being exploited, and patterns of attacks that helps you make better decisions. It can come from many places, including public reports, industry sharing, internal incident data, and security vendor research. The important part is not the source prestige, but the relevance to your environment and the reliability of the information. Threat intelligence adds the real-world question that CVSS alone cannot answer. Is this vulnerability or weakness actually being used by attackers? And if so, how and against whom? It also helps you understand what kinds of attackers might target you, which influences architecture choices like segmentation, authentication strength, and monitoring priorities. In a beginner-friendly way, you can think of threat intelligence as weather forecasting for cyber risk, where you still need a strong house, but it helps to know whether a storm is likely this week. A key concept when combining CVSS and threat intelligence is distinguishing between severity and priority. Severity is about the inherent potential harm of a vulnerability, while priority is about what you should do first given your constraints and your specific exposure. A vulnerability could be severe, but not an immediate priority if the vulnerable component is not deployed, is not reachable, or is already mitigated by compensating controls. Another vulnerability might be less severe in theory, but becomes a high priority if attackers are actively exploiting it and your architecture exposes the vulnerable path. Threat intelligence often provides signals like exploitation in the wild, the availability of easy exploit code, or the inclusion of a weakness in common attack toolkits. Those signals change the urgency because they change likelihood, not just impact. This is why you can see real teams scrambling to address a vulnerability that has strong exploitation signals, even if its theoretical score is not the highest. For architecture decisions, this prioritization must be explicit so the design changes make sense to reviewers and stakeholders. To make this practical, consider what an architect actually chooses when prioritizing risk decisions. Sometimes the decision is tactical, like accelerating a patch or temporarily disabling a risky feature, but architecture thinking asks a broader question. Can we reduce the class of risk, not just this one instance? For example, if threat intelligence indicates attackers are exploiting a remote code execution vulnerability in a component that sits in a high-trust zone, an architectural mitigation might include moving that component behind an additional boundary, limiting inbound paths, or redesigning the workflow so untrusted input does not reach that component directly. Similarly, if CVSS highlights high impact on confidentiality and threat intelligence suggests data theft campaigns are active, an architecture response might prioritize stronger segmentation around data stores and stronger identity controls for access paths. The key is that architecture mitigations often address multiple vulnerabilities at once by changing how trust is distributed. This is different from a purely patch-focused mindset, and it is why prioritization matters so much at the design level. You want to invest in changes that shrink attack surface and blast radius. Another important skill is recognizing when threat intelligence should cause you to challenge an assumption in your design. Many designs contain assumptions like this administrative interface is only reachable internally or only trusted services can call this endpoint. Threat intelligence can reveal that attackers frequently find ways to break those assumptions, such as by compromising a low-trust workstation and then moving laterally, or by exploiting exposed management interfaces that were thought to be hidden. When you see those patterns, prioritization shifts towards strengthening boundaries and verification, not just addressing the latest vulnerability. This is where principles like zero trust start to feel practical, because you stop relying on location alone as a security control. If attackers are known to exploit stolen credentials, then authentication strength and session handling become higher priority even if the immediate vulnerability list is long. If attackers are using supply chain weaknesses, then dependency controls and verification become more urgent. Threat intelligence helps you choose where to harden assumptions into enforceable controls. It is also important to avoid misusing threat intelligence by chasing headlines rather than focusing on relevance. Beginners sometimes think that the most talked about threat is automatically the most important, but that can be a trap. A threat that targets a technology you do not use or a sector you are not in may still be interesting but should not drive immediate architectural changes. Likewise, threat intelligence can contain noise, exaggeration, or incomplete information, so it should be treated as a signal, not a command. The right approach is to ask, does this threat align with our technology stack, our exposure points, and our most valuable assets? If it does, it can raise priority for certain decisions, such as adding safeguards around identity, reducing external exposure, or improving monitoring on specific workflows. If it does not, it might still inform long-term planning, but it should not hijack your immediate priorities. An architect should be calm and systematic, not reactive, and prioritization is how you maintain that steadiness. Now bring CVSS back into the picture and notice how it provides structure when threat intelligence feels messy. Threat intelligence might tell you that attackers are exploiting a vulnerability, but CVSS helps you understand why it might be easy or damaging, which influences mitigation choices. If exploitability metrics indicate the attack requires no privileges and low complexity, then preventive controls at the boundary become especially valuable, such as strict input validation, authentication, and request filtering. If impact metrics show high integrity impact, then you might prioritize protections like strong authorization checks, integrity monitoring, and safe change workflows. If availability impact is high, then you might prioritize rate limiting and resilience measures. CVSS also helps you compare two actively exploited issues by showing which one is likely to cause greater harm if it succeeds. In that sense, CVSS is the measurement framework, while threat intelligence is the situational context. Together, they help you justify why you are focusing on one risk decision now and another later. A simple way to operationalize this combination is to think in terms of three questions that shape architectural priority. First, how exposed are we? Meaning, can the vulnerable path be reached by an attacker given our design boundaries and trust zones? Second, how likely is exploitation, which threat intelligence informs through signals like active campaigns, exploit availability, and attacker focus? Third, what is the impact if it succeeds, which CVSS and your own system understanding inform by mapping the vulnerability to your data and workflows? When all three align toward high risk, you prioritize urgent architectural actions. When one or two are low, you might schedule mitigation but avoid disruptive design changes. This approach is not about producing a perfect risk score, but about making reasoning visible and consistent. It also teaches you to look for design levers that reduce exposure and impact broadly rather than treating each vulnerability as an isolated event. Architectural prioritization also benefits from thinking about compensating controls, which are safeguards that reduce risk even when you cannot immediately fix the underlying vulnerability. If a vulnerability has a high CVSS score and threat intelligence indicates active exploitation, but the affected component cannot be patched quickly, you still have options at the design level. You might restrict access to the affected interface, require stronger authentication for the workflow, add additional checks before sensitive actions are allowed, or isolate the component so compromise does not automatically lead to broader damage. You can also increase monitoring and alerting around likely exploitation behaviors, which does not prevent the attack, but improves detection and response. The key is to choose compensating controls that address the specific threat path rather than adding random controls that look impressive. A compensating control is only useful if it meaningfully interrupts exploitation or reduces what an attacker can achieve. This is where combining CVSS details with threat intelligence tactics makes a difference, because you understand both how the vulnerability works and how attackers are using it. You should also recognize that prioritization is not only about individual vulnerabilities, but about recurring architectural weaknesses. If you repeatedly see vulnerabilities that involve weak authentication, poor authorization checks, or insecure defaults, that suggests a design pattern problem. Threat intelligence may show that attackers love exploiting misconfigurations and exposed management interfaces, which points to architectural decisions about default network exposure and administrative separation. Over time, a mature architecture prioritizes foundational controls that reduce many kinds of risk, such as strong identity, consistent authorization, secure communication, segmentation, and robust logging. CVSS will continue to highlight severe issues, and threat intelligence will continue to highlight new campaigns, but foundational architecture makes each new issue less catastrophic. This is one of the most important insights for new learners. You cannot patch your way to safety if the design keeps reintroducing the same types of weaknesses. Prioritization helps you invest in the changes that reduce future risk not just today's headlines. As you practice applying CVSS and threat intelligence, the best sign that you are thinking like an architect is that your decisions become explainable in plain language. You can say that a certain issue is urgent because it is easy to exploit remotely, it affects a widely deployed component in a reachable zone, and attackers are actively using it. So you will prioritize design actions that reduce exposure immediately. You can also say that another issue is severe in theory, but has low exposure in your architecture, so you will plan a fix while focusing immediate effort elsewhere. That kind of reasoning is not about being defensive or dismissive. It is about making the best use of limited resources while protecting what matters most. When you can connect severity, exposure, likelihood, and impact, you can also communicate clearly with non-security stakeholders without oversimplifying. This is how prioritization becomes a core architecture skill rather than a compliance exercise. Ultimately, combining CVSS with threat intelligence is a way to keep your security design decisions grounded, practical, and focused on reducing real risk in the real world.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.